Hello, everyone. This is Liz Christofferson and Carol Vickers with Empower Consulting Group. On behalf of Practice Pay Solutions, who is the sponsor for the Business Mastery Series, we are excited to welcome you to another wonderful webinar event today. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to have Carol introduce our guest, who will be sharing his brilliance on building an accountable organization in an age of entitlement. But I want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. Just a reminder for those of you who are on the call and those of you who will listen after, a copy of the presentation will be provided by Practice Pay Solutions. So we encourage you to participate. And the way that you can do that is two ways. We have a chat box as well as a question box. So throughout the conversation that we have this morning, we encourage you to type your questions, comments, or suggestions into those boxes, and Carol and myself will provide that information to David, and he can respond accordingly. So again, thank you for joining us today. Carol, would you please introduce our wonderful guest?
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted to. I want to introduce you to David Irvine. David Irvine is sought after internationally as a speaker, an author, and a mentor. His work has contributed to the building of accountable, vital, and engaged organizations across North America. He is the co-founder of the Newport Institute for Authentic Living, whose focus is to build authentic, accountable organizational cultures that unleash greatness. David is the best-selling author of 5 books. Over 250,000 copies have been sold worldwide. He has advanced degrees in human development, science, and social work. With more than 25 years experience as a workshop facilitator, psychotherapist, professional speaker, and consultant, David has developed a unique, personal, and very practical approach to transforming leaders. Every year, thousands of people attend David's inspiring and thought-provoking programs on authentic leadership, accountability, and balanced living. He is one of Canada's most respected voices on leadership and personal development. I'm honored in that I'm also a Canadian to be introducing a Canadian speaker today. He consults with and presents to a wide range of organizations, professional associations, government, education, and healthcare. David has taught courses at 3 universities and the Banff School of Management, NBC's Today Show, the Globe and Mail, and numerous radio and newspaper publications have also interviewed him. On a personal note, and I didn't know this, David is a formerly nationally ranked distance runner and trained with the U.S. Olympic team. He is the father of 3 girls and most recently a grandfather. David lives with his wife Val and family in the beautiful foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Western Canada. David, I am so pleased that you're able to join us today, and as Liz said, we are delighted to have you share your brilliance with us. Please.
Thank you, and thank you to Practice Pay and to everybody who's joined us on this line. We have a very short amount of time together. My goal in the next hour is to shift your perspective and paradigm, if you will, around accountability. Accountability tends not to be an inspired concept. People say, we need to be more accountable around here. People tend not to get inspired by that, and my job is to help you get inspired by this notion of accountability inside of your life and inside of your organization. You can apply this to your family, to any culture that you work in. This is what we do, is that we build organizational and family cultures. And you'll find that from my presentation that accountability is really the cornerstone of a great culture. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. In my previous life, for those of you who don't know me, I was a family therapist for 10 years. Very interesting when you're a family therapist. Nobody ever brings in their good kids. So all I saw were people in pain, troubled kids. If you want to see the epitome of a lack of accountability, work with troubled families. And I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. So I started doing presentations for parents, and I ended up getting business executives who came there as parents who said, gosh, you should bring this knowledge and perspective to our organization. So I started to do work with organizations back in the 80s and got so busy working with organizations, gave up my family therapy practice, went into business with a couple of fellows in Calgary. We wrote our original book on accountability called Accountability, Getting a Grip on Results, and took that around the world. And so it was my philosophy, it was their tool, and that's what I want to share with you today is some of my recent thinking around accountability. So what I want to do is I want to start with having you consider 5 questions. Number one, what is your current process for managing expectations? Think about it. You can't be in an environment, you can't be in a workplace, you can't be in a family without having expectations. So question is, how, and by the way, I'm not here to revolutionize the way that you do your work. It's mostly I'm just here to ask you the Dr. Phil question, which is, how's that working for you? So how does it work for you to manage expectations, and how would you articulate what that process is? That's an accountability process for managing expectations. I have expectations of you, you have expectations of me. How do we manage that process? Number two, how passionate and engaged are people in their work? One of the things you're going to learn in this presentation is that most accountability issues actually aren't accountability issues, they're passion issues. You get people passionate and they're much, much more likely to be accountable. So if you've got an employee or a staff member, colleague who's not accountable and you want to help them be accountable, best thing is to help them reach their passion. Number three, what's the level of undeserved entitlement in your organization? This is the one thing that I hear from in great cultures. This is what troubles CEOs most, is how do we deal with this sense of entitlement? And entitlement is actually a symptom of living in a great culture. It's a symptom of having things too easy. So if you find yourself around people, think of, I'll take the example of Canada, for example. We live in this great culture, not unlike the United States. We live in this great culture, and what happens is we live in a great environment, and what happens is people start to take it for granted. In my work with families, it's very interesting that the kids that were given to the most by their parents have the highest rate of a sense of entitlement, and the most angry at their parents. So we're going to talk about entitlement today. How's the level of alignment between your espoused values and your actions? We all got values. The question is, we all got value statements. The question is, do you have real values? How many of you understand that there's a difference between having value statements and values? How do we get those value statements off the wall and get people living those values? What's your process of accountability to get those value statements off the wall? That's an accountability process. And what's your level of tolerance for mediocrity? What's your tolerance for mediocre performance? How much do we allow mediocre performance to survive? So those are the questions that we're going to be focused on today. I'm going to actually, the agenda is going to be three things. Number one, what is accountability? Number two, why should you care? And number three, how do you cultivate it? Okay, so let's talk about what it is. We talk about accountability. Kids should be more accountable. Government should be more accountable, which is one of the most unaccountable organizations there are. Who is this government that we think should be more accountable? Leaders should be more accountable. We talk about it, folks, as if we understand what we're talking about, and we don't. So I will give you my definition of accountability. You don't have to, you're welcome to use it. What I would encourage, if you want to build accountability in your culture, get crystal clear about how you define it. And then make sure when people come into your office and they say, we need to be more accountable around here, let's first of all sit down and understand what exactly are we meaning. Because we all assume that we know what we're talking about. Most of the time we talk about accountability, we talk about it in terms of blame and punishment. And actually, when you see blame going on in an organization, it actually indicates that you don't have accountability. So here's our definition of accountability. I want to give recognition to my co-author, Jim Rieger here from Victoria, Canada, who has made a tremendous impact on me in terms of helping me understand organizational culture. He was a former VP in Hewlett-Packard back in the HP days when Hewlett-Packard had this, and still remains now, but it had this great culture that was developed in Hewlett-Packard. And he reported directly to Bill and Dave back in the 70s. So he's really impacted a lot of my thinking around organizational culture and how you build accountability within that culture. But here's how we define accountability, the ability to be counted on. And I want you to stop and think about how complacent and lazy, you don't have to be unethical to be unaccountable, but we have become very lazy, even a retail store. I'll just give you a quick example. How often do we just take for granted that a retail store is not going to keep their promise? We had some furniture delivered the other day, and the furniture company said they'd deliver it at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning. And at 10 to 9, and I hear those kind of promises a lot. I'm very mindful of the fact of how easy it is to just make a promise and then blow people off and not treat it seriously. And at 5 to 9, we got a call from the driver that was delivering the furniture and said, I'm just around the corner. I want to make sure I've got your right address because we agreed to have it to your house by 9 o'clock. And my first response was, wow, how could that happen? Now, why is it that when people keep their promises, we wow people? And it's because we've become so, for want of a better word, lazy. We aren't rigorous enough in terms of being mindful. When you make a promise, you're going to keep it. Okay? So here's a little assignment for you. We won't do this here, but in your own mind, make a list of everybody in your life that you can count on. That unequivocally, if they say they're going to do it, they do it. You can sleep at night because you know it's going to get done. In my experience, when I do this in our workshops, we come up, some people are hard-pressed to find 5 people in their life. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to celebrate those people and shine a light on those people every single day. You don't build an accountable culture, folks, with a stick, beating people into accountability. You do it primarily with a flashlight, shining light on when people keep their promises. Whenever you see accountable action, whether it's in your families, it's in your organizations, if you see people keep a promise, make a promise and keep a promise. I had an executive show me his process for accountability. He carries a little black book around with him. Every time he makes a promise, he writes it down in his book, and then that night he transfers it into his BlackBerry, because that's his process for holding himself accountable, to make sure he's very meticulous about following through on promises. So make a list of everybody in your life that you can count on. Now, if I ask those that you serve to do this assignment, your employees, your colleagues, all of your stakeholders, would you be on their list? See, what I've learned about accountability, it's a lot easier to see a lack of accountability in other people than it is in ourselves. It's a lot easier to be sitting at the dentist's office when the dentist is 20 minutes late and complaining that the dentist didn't keep her promise to show up on time. It's a lot easier to be frustrated with the dentist or when other people make us late than it is to be frustrated with ourselves. Hey, when did we not follow through on a promise? Number 3, whose list have you earned the privilege to be on? So what I find is people who are unaccountable, they tend to suck us into blaming them for the unaccountable people. If you walk into a culture, you'll have people blaming people, and then you'll have people blaming the unaccountable people, because when you're unaccountable, it's like a disease, and you get contaminated by other people's lack of accountability, by getting drawn into them being unaccountable. So take it back to yourself. Resist that tendency. Every one of you are going to be sitting here today thinking of 5 other people that you think should hear this message, especially if you've got kids. You'll be thinking about all the young people that, or whatever, other people that you think should hear this message. Resist that tendency and say, hey, how can I learn to be more accountable? Because accountable people take ownership, and regardless of the culture around them. So here's number 2. So that's what it is. Now let's talk about number 2. Why should you care about accountability? Well, when we wrote our book, we purposefully came up with this image on the front cover, because we really talk about trust in relationships. And when I ask people, what business are you in? Ultimately, folks, no matter what business you're in the business of building trust. If you can't build trust with your customers, with your colleagues, with your employees, with your boss, if you can't build trust with people, you just aren't going to be in business. And it's the foundation of not just the marketplace, but it's the foundation of any relationship. And the keystone in that trusting relationship is this keystone called accountability. And this is the foundation in any significant relationship that you want to build in terms of trust. But it's also, I compare accountability to the roots of a tree. You don't see necessarily the strength that comes from being accountable, but it's not the fierceness of the storm that's going to crack us. It's the strength of our roots. And roots are to a tree what accountability is to a person's life and to a person's organization. This ability to be counted on. Now, who's the first person that you need to know you can count on? It's, of course, the promises that you make to yourself. And I use this example. How many of you have ever made a promise to yourself at 6 o'clock, you're going to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and exercise? That's a promise. You don't, now I'm not saying that you have to get up and exercise in order to be accountable. You may decide, I need more rest than exercise, so I'm going to sleep until 7. Then you can maintain your accountability because you can be counted on. I'm going to sleep in. You kept a promise to yourself. But if you keep a promise, if you make a promise to yourself to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and exercise, then the alarm clock goes off, and you wake up and you're rolling around and you're thinking, this is mind over mattress. Should I or shouldn't I get up? This is not the time to get up. This is not the time to decide whether you're going to get up. This is the time to get up, because when did you make the promise? The night before. And what happens is that when you keep a promise, and every one of us have had the experience of putting our feet on the floor in the morning, getting ourselves out of bed, whether you feel like it or not, but you kept a promise to yourself. An hour later, how do you feel about yourself? Well, you feel you have a lot more self-respect. And we say that that's the endorphins from the exercise. I suggest that it's the endorphins that come from accountability, because it's energizing when you keep a promise to yourself and know whether, especially if it was a tough promise, you kept it, you have self-respect. It's inspiring to be around people who are accountable. It's energy producing. Notice the people in your life that you put on your accountability list. I've had executives call their assistants at the break and say, you know what, you're on my list. Now you might want to tell them what that is, what that list is. But when people are accountable, it's energy producing. And this is what we're trying to build. So this is a story about the Chinese bamboo story. And I understand it takes about 4 years where a bamboo tree in China will grow about 1 inch. And what they're doing is in those 4 years, they're developing a root system to support these kind of structures. And in the 5th year, the bamboo tree will grow 100 feet. And the only way it can do that is to have the support of the root system. And that is my analogy, our analogy of what it takes of the value of accountability in a life and in an organization. You can't run an organization unless you can be counted on, right? That's the foundation of any culture and of any life. So now what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of the time talking about just how do you cultivate accountability within a culture. How do you build it around you? Because I want to make this a practical kind of an approach here. So there are 3 stages. There are 3 stages to building accountability in one's life. The first, and these aren't linear necessarily stages, they go back and forth, but they are necessary tasks to reach this objective in terms of being a person who can be counted on. And my first stage is this thing called dependency. We were all here once, right? And one of the things is you can't hold a baby accountable for anything. Why? Because they're completely dependent. And my experience is, first of all, my observation and research, we've researched this, you have to go through the dependent stage in order to be accountable. If a child has never been allowed to have parents or an adult structure and system in their life that they can count on, what does a baby need? They need to know that if they cry, a mother will come or a father will come or an adult will come and respond so that they can be dependent on that adult. Children who have never been able, who grew up too fast or have never been able to be dependent, what we find is that they have to reparent themselves some point in their life. They have to be dependent on some kind of a system to gain that confidence within themselves that they're worth being dependable. So that's the first stage, is dependence. Now, how many of you know people who are in their 40s who have never gotten out of that stage, who are completely dependent on the organization? You can tell a person's level of dependency by how much they blame and complain. People who blame other people are still in one form or another in the dependent stage because they're still depending on other people to come through for them. Now, we're all dependent at one level, but we have to go through all 3 stages that I'm going to talk about in order to fully be what we call interdependent. So that's the first stage, is that we have to allow ourselves to be dependent. And if you want to foster accountability in children, the first stage is to allow them to be dependent on you and to invest in them when they're very young. All right, stage 2 is what we call independence. Now, there's really 2 portions to stage 2. One is what we call adolescent independence, and then the part two of stage 2 is achievement independence. So adolescence independence really isn't full independence. Adolescents try to think it is, but basically what it is that's just a resistance, and it's a defiance. And we think that that's moving toward independence. It's the first step toward true independence, but ultimately, to be independent, you have to plant your flag, have a goal, and achieve something. And move forward with a sense of, I can accomplish this separate from other people. That's in theory, that's the second stage in completeness. Now, once you've been able to achieve something and become really fully independent, then you really reach the highest level of accountability, which says, you can depend on me. And this is the stage where you become independent, but you realize you can only go so far with independence. And if there's one thing, I've made a mistake in my business. I've been way too independent. I'm actually learning in my 50s now to be much more interdependent and collaborative, because I know that you can't fully achieve your potential without also now being in a team environment, being in a collaborative environment, and using other people to take you to the, using other people and contributing to other people, and building relationships in a trusting way that says, you can depend on me. So those are essentially the three phases, stages, if you will, of how one gets to this thing called accountability. You can depend on me. Now, what I have is that I have 5 steps, 5 concrete steps for how you build an accountable culture around you. And you can apply this to any culture that you're living in or working in. So step 1, and I'm going to put this in an organizational context because this is where I spend pretty much all my time these days, is to hire accountable people. If you want an accountable culture, hire accountable people. So here's a couple things around accountability. First of all, you can learn to be accountable. I don't know if it can be taught. It must be caught. You can catch accountability, but you can't really theoretically teach it. But it's much easier to build accountability with a child, foster that accountability with a child, than it is later on in life. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but accountability is a lot like a culture. It's a lot easier to build a great culture than it is to change a culture. Just like it. So if you want accountability, hire accountable people. So here's a couple key points around this. What's your process? If you want accountability as a value in your culture, what's your process for hiring? When you have a job interview with someone, how do you know if they're accountable? They might look accountable. Obviously, part of that, there's an apprentice, an observation to watch them respond to stress. But you can get it through stories. And you know, the challenge with a webinar like this, I'd love to hear your stories about how you hire accountable staff. But one of the questions is, questions to ask them is, how did you learn to be accountable when you grew up? And what happens when things don't go your way? And hear stories, hear experiences, hear their experiences around how they learn to become a person that they can be counted on. Where did you learn this? In the references. When you're researching references, ask them how accountable they were. And focus it as a primary value if you want to build accountability in your culture. You all know this. When you've got accountability within people, when you have that mindset that says, you know what, they've reached that stage of interdependence, that says you can count on me, it's much, much easier to build a great culture with those kind of folks. All right, number 2, we've actually talked about this. This is bring a flashlight to work and shine a light on accountable action. This is one of the most powerful ways that you can build accountability. The problem is that people who are accountable tend not to actually get noticed. They don't even need to be noticed, but you need to recognize them and make sure they're supported within your culture, because what often happens are the accountable people get taken for granted. And all of the time and energy gets based on people who you're trying to get them to be accountable, whereas you really want to build this by example and find people who've got it and really foster them and say, you know what, and acknowledge them. You're an accountable person. Recognize, reward, shine a light on it publicly and personally. This is the kind of behavior that we're expecting around here. And don't be afraid. If you're trying to manage your boss, right, you're managing your boss, don't be afraid to shine a light on your boss's ability to be accountable and how much you appreciate that and express your gratitude around that. Step number 3, I want to spend a little time on how do you inspire people to be accountable. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of rah-rah. This is my slide kind of shows a rah-rah kind of an inspiration that comes from a motivational speaker. I'm talking about deep inside. How do you build a sense of inspiration? Because if you don't inspire people into accountability, it won't sustain itself. You can coerce people through positional power how to be accountable. But the best way to sustain it is to inspire people to do that. So the story I'm going to tell you comes from my dad. And I'm just going to share with you what my dad did. I'd like you to think about where were the seeds of accountability planted in you. How did you learn to be accountable? You know what? You wouldn't be on this call today if you weren't accountable. In fact, I think most people who want to come and learn about accountability tend to be the people that are the most accountable. People who are unaccountable tend to not be engaged in their own, as much as in their own learning. So every one of you have a degree, to some degree of accountability. And if you reflect back on who the people were in your life who influenced you to be accountable, we all know how to foster this, but we just break it down. This is what I want to do with you today. So let me tell you about my dad. My dad was the Canadian gymnastics champion back in the 1940s. He used to walk around the house on his hands. There's my favorite pictures in the middle. It's on the top of a little mountain, I'd say quite a large mountain outside of Banff National Park here just west of Calgary. And my dad inspired me. He would never have, I don't think he ever used the word accountability. I would never have used that word growing up when I was influenced. But in retrospect, first of all, he got me inspired by him being inspired. It's interesting, you got a 60-year-old walking around the house on his hands. That's a little bit inspiring, although I kind of took it for granted. But the first step, if you want to build accountability around you, be inspiring, be passionate, find something that you're passionate about, because that will, in itself, from my experience, and research will certainly bear this out, my experience will, it inspires other people to want to step up. So my dad got me inspired. He took me down to the gym every Saturday, tried to turn me into a gymnast. His parallel bars was his main event. And I never in 3 years got the strength to be able to lift myself up on a pair of parallel bars. So I think my dad finally gave up on that, but he never gave up on helping me find what my passion was. And he discovered I had a passion to run, and he went out, he knew nothing about running, but back in the 70s, running was not popular, especially not in rural Canada, and got me out on the roads and measured it, and then he says, but you got to get up, if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you got to be able to get up in the morning. So 5 o'clock, the alarm would go off, and he said, you're going to run 10 miles. And he built me up to 10 miles. He was my coach, got me built up to 10 miles. And then he said, now then you got to do after you do the 10 miles, you got to do the chores on the farm. And but my alarm clock went off. When it went off, if I wasn't out of bed in 5 minutes, my dad would be in my room on his hands. It's really hard to argue with a guy on his hands. He would walk along the bed on his hands, do a little flip, land on the end of my bed, grab my feet, and then he proceeded to give me a lecture. After I had kids, I called them teaching opportunities, but back in those days, I called them lectures, and I can still hear my dad's voice in my head, and this is what he said. He said, David, the purpose of having a dream is not to achieve your dream. The purpose of having a dream is to inspire you to become the kind of person that it takes to achieve your dream. He said, very few people will ever make it to the Olympics, and even fewer will stand on the podium, but anybody can become the kind of person that it takes to achieve that dream. Anybody can become the kind of person that it takes to be an Olympic athlete. And he said, if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you better declare your independence from two things. Number one, a warm bed. Now get up. And so he inspired me to do that. But you see, he taught me if I couldn't put my feet on the floor in the morning even though I didn't feel like it, I'd never make what it took to be an Olympic athlete. And what he really showed me was that to build accountability, you got to be able to count on yourself. And then I'd be heading out, and I'd be 30 below up here, and couldn't see the end of our driveway. I'd be heading back to bed, and my dad would be standing there by my bedroom. By this time, he said, David, the second thing you better declare your independence from is the weather. He said, there's no such thing as bad weather. There's only bad clothes. Now go out and get a run, and you feel a whole lot better about yourself. This is the way that my dad fostered accountability in me, is that he was passionate. He helped me find my passion, and then he held my toe to the fire. He had very high standards. No one takes pride in doing something that's easy. But he cared deeply. He was passionate. These are the qualities that it takes to inspire people. And this is how he did that. Now, the end of my story is that I eventually went on a track scholarship down to the States. I trained with the U.S. Olympic team, but I was actually training for the to make the Canadian Olympic team in Canada in the 1980 Olympics before they were boycotted. But that was my little story there. Anyway, you inspire people by being accountable. Take ownership. See all blame as a waste of time. Think carefully before you make an agreement. Scrupulously honor your promises. And apologize. When you make a promise and you don't come through on that promise, apologize immediately. As I said earlier, no one takes pride in raising their hand and said, no one will think less of you when you raise your hand and say, I'm responsible for this. That's something that I know Lance Armstrong right now is struggling with, right? So come clean as soon as you can, because if you let it go on and on, you just get yourself in deeper trouble. This is the true joy in life, the being used by a purpose. This is George Bernard Shaw at the age of 93. This is the true joy of life, the being used by a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Let me just go back to my last slide. My dad would have loved George Bernard Shaw. Taking ownership. What does it really mean to take ownership? I have a story that I was on a plane the other day. It's a couple of years ago now, but I was on a plane, and I'm always looking for people who take ownership. And it was a flight attendant on a little flight from Halifax, out in eastern Canada, out to Charlottetown on Prince Edward Island. And this flight attendant was a happy, joyous flight attendant, but that's not what impressed me. What impressed me was not necessarily her spirit of enthusiasm. What impressed me was, well, she was serving drinks. It was a 20-minute flight, and she came down the aisle. One could say she had no positional power, but she took ownership for her culture. And while she's pushing her little cart down that aisle, she said, you know, Mr. Irvine, there's 37 passengers on this flight. She said, Mr. Irvine, we have 2 drinks. We have water and we have juice. Which would you prefer? I would be glad to serve you. Now, it wasn't her enthusiasm that impressed me. What impressed me, how did she know my name? And I'm always interested in finding people who take ownership for their culture. I get inspired by that. And afterwards, I stayed after and talked to her and said, how did you do that? And she showed me. It's like a magician. How did you do that trick? By the way, I thought I was thinking pretty good of myself, a couple of seats off, you know, because I looked at her and I said, do you know everybody's name? And she said, no, only the special ones. And what I realized is she knew every single person's name on that flight. She knew the person in front of me. She knew the person behind me. She actually memorized everybody's name for those 9 minutes before, when the gate closed, to where she served drinks. She said, I don't ever like to waste any time. She had a little on all of the stubs for all the passengers with their seat assignments and memorized it. Now, she obviously had a gift to do that, but when people use their gift, you don't have to know people's names and be able to memorize people's names to be accountable, but if you're using your gifts and you take ownership and bring that sense of enthusiasm and ownership to the culture, it's inspiring, and that's what I call accountability. I want to share with you a little bit about my mother, because I can't talk about accountability without honoring my parents. If any of you had parents who lived through the Second World War, you understand that none of those parents had to go to a course on how to build accountability with people. They had these words like maturity and initiative and duty, and they lived accountability. And they taught me not by what they said, but by how they lived. And I think of my mother. This is my mother's house in the prairies in Western Canada in the 1930s. Now, 12 kids lived in that house. It's a 900 square foot shack. Best we can say is this is about a 1931 picture. I haven't been able to really verify that, but that's the best we can. That's the best we can guess. And there isn't 1 ounce of entitlement in my mother's bones. She felt grateful for every single thing that she had, and she lived this sense of gratitude. And I'll just show you this little picture here. I like this little slide here. I've decided I want to be a millionaire when I grow up. Well, you have to work pretty hard to get $1 million. No, I won't. You will. Me, I just want to inherit it. And this is what happens when we've been given too much. We develop this sense of entitlement. When my mother, after she passed away in 1999, she died broke. She didn't leave anything financially for our kids, but I often ask people, I said, what would you rather have your parents leave you? A rich financial inheritance with no character and values, or character and values and no money? Because with character and values, you can create wealth and much, much more. In my mother's will, she left 3 things to me. Number 1, she said to my son David, she had a paragraph devoted to this. She said to my son David, I leave my passion for learning. She left all of her library books for me. I have books that were written back in 1930 by women and men of true character. One of them was Nellie McClung, one of the famous women in Canada. And she left me her passion for learning. I got all her library books. I feel so rich having that wisdom on my shelf. Many of my books are filled with her quotes that she had from many of her books. The second thing she left me was her passion for music. And she said, you get my piano. I got the 1902 Huntsman piano. And she said, take that passion and take it on to your kids. Third thing I got from my mother was her quote book. And out of her quote book came this quote. The ability, this is maturity, the ability to do a job whether or not you're supervised, finish a job once you start it, carry money without spending it. Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. And then number 4, be able to bear an injustice without wanting to get even. So she lived it. And I can't stress enough, if you want to build accountability around you, be accountable. Okay? Henry Ford said you can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. You got to do it. You can inspire people with an inspiring vision. Do you bring a vision to your work? As small as it might be, it doesn't need to be a huge vision. I always tell people, Martin Luther King did not stand up and say, I have a strategic plan. I have a dream. What's your dream? If you don't have a dream, if you don't have a vision, if you're not bringing passion to your work, it's very difficult to build accountability because you can't build it with a stick. I ask people, why do you get out of bed in the morning? Do you have an answer to that? What I often hear is the number 1 reason why I hear people get out of bed in the morning is to pee. Well, you better, that's a good place to start, but you better have a place that goes beyond that. Eh? Step number 4, so you got to inspire people. Step number 4 is you got to connect with people. If you're not connected to the people around you, you can't possibly foster accountability. And the analogy that I use, it's going from being a father to being dad. Every single person on this line had a father. But I'm going to suggest not all of you had dads. What's the difference between people who invest in your life? You can get, and people who invest in your life and people who make you comply. As my colleague John Maxwell says, everyone communicates, but few connects. I think we're at a point where it's going to be very, very difficult in this, what I call this parallel universe, where we're all on this, this technology is a great tool, but it cannot be a substitute for connecting with people one-on-one. And I would really suggest, if you want to build accountability in your culture, the first thing you want to ask yourself, how connected am I? Because you're not going to be able to foster accountability over the Internet. The Internet, I always say, is a great tool to pass along information. It's a lousy tool to connect with people. I learned accountability from this man. This is me when I was 17 years old, fencing with one of our hired hands. This guy came to work on our farm, one of the poorest men I've ever met. Lived in an old dirt shack, but I'll tell you, he was the happiest man I ever met. He taught me how to shake a hand. He used to say, this is Norris, and he says, you shake a hand like an old fish. He says, you got to learn how to shake a hand. He taught me pride. He invested in me. He taught me the pride of workmanship. He taught me the pride of keeping a promise. He planted these seeds early in my life, and I know my parents were very intentional in bringing Norris into my life because they understood they couldn't do it all. And he was very instrumental for me in teaching me this thing called accountability. But it's the difference for me between being a boss and being a leader. Now, we all need bosses, and we all need leaders. Organizations need bosses, and organizations need leaders. The question is, where are you spending your time? What I've done here, this is the boss column on the left. This is the leader column on the right. By the way, you get promoted to being a boss, but you don't get promoted to being a leader. You have to earn that right. You have to earn the right to invest in people's lives if you're going to hold them accountable. And one of the things is I go through this list, ask yourself how much time are you spending on the transformational side. Regardless of your position, this doesn't take a title to be a leader. All it takes is a decision to invest in people's lives around you. It's what I call in the organizational development field, it's the difference between transactional and transformational. Bosses manage, enforce, supervise. They're in front of the computer. They're about knowing. It's about deficiencies. It's about what Jim Collins tells as a time teller. And it's about control. Now, there's no question that bosses are necessary in an organization. But most organizations I work with, or a good part of many of the organizations I work with, are overbossed and underled. And one of the myths is that you build accountability through a transactional approach. And all you get with a transactional approach to building accountability, all you get by being tougher on people is that you get compliance. You don't get engagement, which is what leaders do on the other side, which is mentoring, inspiring, serving. You're in front of people. You're learning. It's about strengths. It's about a clock builder. That this is what we build together. A time teller is everybody sets their time according to the boss. A clock builder says this is what we build together. What we really want to do is to get unleashed. We want the passion to be unleashed. And what's that passion gets unleashed through the connections with people, then it's much, much easier to build an accountability system. If you build an account, and this is where I learned this the hard way. We would go into organizations year after year, and you know, we did these long-term accountability projects, and we got all these fancy systems built, and we got everybody using accountability agreements, but we forgot this notion of engagement and leadership, and we did it from a coercion point of view, and it never sustained itself. It lasted for a little while through positional power, but you got to get to people's hearts. This is a slide that my kids gave me that show the difference between a boss and your leader. By the way, ask any kid. You got kids at home, nieces, nephews, grandkids. Ask them what's the difference between a boss and a leader. They've never had a course in this, but they'll tell you. When they go to school, ask them who are the bosses, who are the leaders. And I'll tell you what I want with my kids. I want both. We need bosses, people that will be tough, but we also need leaders. Both of us all of us to some degree have to be both. But know when you have to be the boss. And if you're pushing, see, accountability takes two things. You got to support people on the leadership side, and then you got to push people. But you won't build accountability if you support people when they need to be pushed, or if you push people when they need to be supported. You've got to keep asking yourself that every single day. Now, this is how you make this real. You've got to connect to what I call people's authentic self. Now, I used to think you had to know something to write a book about it. What I've discovered is if you want to learn something, write a book about it, travel around the country and talk about it for 15 years. In the late 90s, we were interested in doing research. I wanted to write a book about leadership, and we were interested in doing a book about leadership. We interviewed several hundred people in 300 organizations, and what we asked them is, what do you want from your leaders? And what we got from our research is basically boiled down to one thing. We just want our leaders to get past the fads, the gimmicks, and the flavors of the month. We just want our leaders to be real. So my work shifted from a leadership book to a very personal book about becoming real, journey to authenticity. And what it's all about is this journey to discovering your passion, your purpose, your unique talents, your values, and what we call your sweet spot. Everybody has a sweet spot. And I'll just talk about that in a second. But unless you can get to people's authentic self, you really aren't going to have sustainability in terms of accountability. Your sweet spot is that place inside where you serve both the world and the soul's desire. And what we do now is that we integrate this work around accountability, and that's the one book, with the work that we do around authenticity. And that's what gets engagement, loyalty, and commitment. That's what we're after. And my three primary premises around this: accountability without connection is compliance, accountability without passion is drudgery, and accountability with authenticity is destiny. You have to integrate those together. And one of the big problems, I think, as I see people build accountability in their system, is if you don't integrate, in your own words, this notion of engagement through authenticity, all you get is a compliance system. Okay? Your sweet spot has to do with, and this is where I learned as an entrepreneur, that any entrepreneur understands. What do you do when you work, when you start your business? You do everything. But the key is to find your sweet spot. If you continue to do everything as an entrepreneur, your business will grow for a while, and then it will hit what Dan Sullivan calls the ceiling of complexity, and then it will diminish, and you'll get burned out. And the way you grow as an entrepreneur is you find your sweet spot and you delegate everything else. Now, this is what we do around accountability. If you want to get people engaged, find their sweet spot. Do an inventory of the last 100 hours of your work and ask yourself what percentage was in your sweet spot. Now, there's no magic answer. I had an accountant ask me once, what's the right number to be in the sweet spot? There's no magic answer to that. But the more you can foster people being in their sweet spot, I'm telling you, people will be accountable in their sweet spot. And they'll be accountable outside of their sweet spot. You can't have 100% of your sweet spot at work. You got to have some of that away from work. But if you're fostering a climate where people build their sweet spot where they work, that is what engages people. And then you're in a place to build an accountable system. Once you're fostering a commitment to say, you know, what are your unique abilities? What are your talents? What are your gifts? What are your values? And let's bring more of your passion to what you do. It may be 20%, but what if you could talk to your boss about increasing that to 30%? I mean, how many of you on your last performance review had this question about what gives you sweet satisfaction? Because that's what I want you to support you to do. Okay? My final step is now you design and execute an engaging, meaningful accountability process. Most people start with step 5 and they wonder why it falls apart. You have to do the fundamental work of step 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order to be ready to do step 5. You ultimately can't just have people engaged and caring about each other and inspired. You still have to produce results. And this is the process that produces results. So I'm going to ask you to think about what is your current process for managing expectations in your organization. Whether it's what's your current performance review, how do you use job descriptions, what's your way of managing expectations. Now I have 3 criteria to assess the value of your current system. Again, I'm not here to tell you to change your system, and I'm not here to sell you on a system. I'm here to simply ask you to really examine your current system. Here's 3 things that any great system needs to produce. It needs to give you energy. In other words, when you walk out of a performance review, when you walk out of an accountability process, whatever you want to call it, whatever you call it inside of your organization, do you feel energized in that meeting? Do you walk out of it feeling more inspired and more energized? Number 2, do you walk out of it clearer about what your expectations are and what your expectations are of each other, so that you can say, this is where my targets are, and this is where my goals are, and these are the results that I'm going to produce? And number 3, do you feel supported? Do you feel supported by your stakeholders, by your boss, by your employees, by your colleagues? Have you got a system where people feel those 3 things? Now, I'm going to tell you, if you're getting those 3 results from your current accountability system, then I have nothing to teach you except congratulate yourself and move forward and keep doing what you're doing and appreciate what you've got there. If, however, you're finding that your energy's drained, your clarity isn't there, you don't feel the support, then let me give you some of the key elements of an effective accountability process. And again, we have in many organizations, we've revolutionized all of their performance management systems, and they just build in accountability agreements. They use this as a process. Other organizations, they have their existing process, and what we do is that we just come in and help them fine-tune and make better what they've already got. By the way, this accountability process is a 2-page process. Any performance management system that requires more than 2 pages is not going to be energizing. It's not going to give you clarity. So I say limit it to 2 pages. Have a statement of contribution. What's your passion? This is about finding your passion, finding that authentic self, and really making a statement. This is what I would like to bring to the organization. Number 2 is, what do I promise to give the organization? in terms of operational accountabilities and leadership accountabilities. And this is the operational part is what's unique to my role, what results will I produce? And how do you take this from a performance, from a job description, which typically are activities, to a real operational accountability, which is about concrete results that you're producing. Now, the leadership accountability is how you're going to live your values. You get those value statements off the wall, and you say, how do we turn those value statements into specific behaviors, and how do we turn those specific behaviors into promises so that those value statements become real values? And everyone has leadership accountability. That's the kind of climate that you're creating there. Support requirements. If I'm going to produce this, this is the support that I need. So it's a partnership back and forth. Number 4 are consequences. Without consequences, you have no accountability. But it's not about necessarily negative consequences. Start with positive. What positive consequences do we have? What positive consequences do we want as a result of living those accountabilities? And then number 5 is how do we follow up? How often do we need to meet so that we keep this agreement live, so that we keep each other engaged? And my accountabilities to you are your support requirements to me, and my support requirements to you are your accountabilities to me. This is what locks us in. So my support requirements become my accountabilities, become your accountabilities to me, and vice versa. This is what locks us into partnerships. The bottom line is that with all this engagement, you still have to hold people to account. And I like Colin Powell's quote about this. Everyone on the team knows who is not performing, who is and who is not performing, and they're looking to you as the leader to see what you're going to do about it. So you know that if people are not fulfilling their accountabilities, you have to have the courage to follow through and get the consequences to that. Even after you've paid for the foundation, you still have to hold people's toe to the fire. So in summary, how do you cultivate an accountability? You hire the right people. You shine a light on accountable action. You inspire people. You inspire people by being accountable. You inspire people by taking ownership without blame. You inspire people by having a vision, by bringing your passion to what you do. Number 4, you connect. You connect to people to really find out, to mentor them and to invest in their lives, and you connect with their authentic self. You connect with them as a person. People really don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You care about people and invest in their lives. And then you follow through with a very clear accountability process that engages people, that gets people clear about what results they're going to produce, and that you hold them to the fire in terms of holding them to account for the results that they say they're going to produce. So that's my presentation, and I think at this point I'd be open for question and answer. We can have just a little bit of a dialogue here for the next 7 minutes, and then I just got a couple more slides to finish this off. Carol, if you want to take over from there.
Thank you so much, David. That's just wonderful information, and I've taken lots of notes. I'm sure many of us have. We have one question, and I'm going to check to see if you may have answered it as the slides progressed. Joseph asked how to start a culture change process. And Joseph, I just want to clarify perhaps what I understand that to ask is some of us are in cultures where we might want to see this as part of how to create it. How do you change it if you're in that already?
Well, it's a great question, Joseph. The first question is to ask yourself what level you're at. So so a CEO, I'd answer, if you're a CEO of a company, I would say, I would answer that question differently than if you're a frontline service provider. But let's put you in the middle, anywhere you want. The basic bottom line is start with yourself. Write your own accountability agreement. What do I want to contribute here? Get passionate. Write your own accountability. No, but you don't need permission to write your own accountability agreement and to be accountable. Write your own contribution statement. This is where my passion is. This is what my vision is. These are my unique talents. These are my gifts. Put that in 2 or 3 sentences, what you're really passionate about. A vision of what that change would look like. Number 2, what do you promise to deliver on? What kind of values? How do how will you live the values here? You might have a statement of values. Make it personal around this is what I'm committed to. These are the results that I'll produce. Then you go to your boss and you say, this is the support that I need because I want to learn to be accountable. and I want to express, I'm passionate about accountability here, and I want to create an accountable culture. Do I have your support to back me on this? And you start it by, I always say there's three kinds of leaders. There's executive leaders, there's frontline leaders, which are people who manage the front lines, and then there's frontline leaders who are actually doing the work. And you can lead at any level by taking accountability for your own results and your own culture. Now, once you do that, you get allies around you to build accountability, and you start where you are. That's the bottom line. And if you then, by doing everything you can to be accountable, you have a culture that doesn't support that, then you take a careful look at, maybe this is not the right culture for me to live in. Maybe this is a place I can't live my values.
Right, right. And Liz had just suggested that this would also work with smaller organizations when resources are tight. This is something that can be initiated internally.
Of course, where you can do this in a small, I do a lot of work with small family businesses, with small entrepreneurial companies. This is a great model for people to sit down. That's really the best place for it to work, because you're not dealing with bureaucracies. You're dealing with, you can deal with, real people that really want to make a difference here, and that you've got some positional power to do that, and really sit down together and say, what are we each going to take accountability for? And you may not have the financial resources to give people positive consequences in terms of stock options and but what is meaningful to people? What consequences, what rewards would you like when you achieve your accountabilities? What really matters to you? And have those conversations in an entrepreneurial company. That's the ideal place to have it.
Right. Excellent. And I made a note about catching accountability, and I think that describes a very an easy way to do that. If you are being accountable, then it is contagious. Totally.
Yeah, totally. I really don't. I mean, I give keynote addresses and workshops around accountability, but what it is the power in this comes from our facilitation, where we go in and really facilitate conversation, because it's all about conversations. You can't really teach someone to be accountable. You can kind of give people some language and some words, but you can't really teach it. Like you say, it has to be caught, not taught.
Right, right. I'll let you give us our last couple of slides.
Well, my last slide is the law of the echo. And the law of the echo is whatever you give out will come back to you tenfold. This just happens to be a little bit west of our place here, the Three Sisters up by Banff. And the whole law of the echo is if you want whatever you want in a culture, give it. If you want people to appreciate you more, then take accountability to get so busy appreciating other people that you don't have time to feel sorry for yourself because you're not getting enough appreciation. If you want more accountability in a culture, bring more accountability to that. Now, it may not come back to you right away, but it will come back. If you want more peace in the world, bring more peace to the world. Whatever you want, take accountability to give it. And my final, this is what Gandhi said when he said, be the change that you wish to see in the world. This is the ultimate act of accountability. When you say the culture that I'm complaining about is actually the culture that I'm creating. And if I want to change the culture around me, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a family, whether it's an organization, it has to start with me. And my final slide is if you want to contact me, I'd love to hear from you. You'll have a copy of these slides. If you want to copy, information on the books that I have, this is my email address, email@val@davidirvine.com. There's our website, and I've just started to use this thing called Twitter, so I'm trying to build a little bit of a network through that over the last little while. But it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. I hope that I have shifted some of your thinking. There's so much information that I have. It's always difficult in an hour, but I hope I've given you something to think about, to go back and talk about with your teams, and how you just continue to have the conversation going here. And I'd love to give you any support along the way. Thank you very much for having me.
That's really wonderful, David and Carol. Thank you so much to both of you for a remarkable presentation. David, you have touched on so many things that you're absolutely right. The accountability applies to every aspect of our life and our business. And I think I loved that first thing that you said, make a list of the people in your life that you can hold accountable, but then that really, really powerful question, the people around you, when they make their list, are you going to be on it? Because I think it always starts with ourselves. We have to look at ourselves first before we start looking at all the things externally that we want to change in the world. So thank you so much, David Irvine and Carol Vickers, for joining us today. David's website is www.davidirvine.com. I encourage you to connect with him, to email val@davidirvine.com with your questions, with your comments, for additional information about the wonderful, wonderful programs that he offers. On behalf of Practice Pay Solutions, this is Liz Christopherson and Carol Vickers with Empower Consulting Group. Thank you for participating in our program today. We wish you a wonderful, wonderful day and great success, and we look forward to your interaction and participation on the next Business Mastery Series program. Take care, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.